With Palm Sunday approaching, I've been reading through Mark's Gospel, specifically through Mark 11 and some of the surrounding chapters. And there's some really interesting stuff in this section and a lot of things pertaining to the temple. And so I just wanted to take a look at some of this. So, broadly speaking, the surrounding sections of the Triumphal Entry and whatnot, you're going to have the beginning of Mark 11. Jesus is going to have the Triumphal Entry. He's going to be led in by a procession into the city. He's going to look. He's going to go into the temple, kind of look around, and then leave. The next day, they're going to go to the temple, and on the way, Jesus curses the fig tree. Then he goes to the temple. He clears out the temple, and he begins to teach, and people are amazed by his teaching. And then he leaves. On the way back, they see the withered fig tree, and they remark on that. Jesus again teaches them about prayer and things like that. Say to this mountain to be cast into the sea, that kind of stuff. Then the next day they come back to the temple again, and Jesus' authority is questioned. He gives some parables, and this is now in chapter 12. He's going to teach some more. And then as he's leaving again the temple, the disciples remark on the temple itself, and Jesus prophesies the destruction of the temple. So keep all this in mind because all of these things are connected. The way Mark weaves the stories, specifically the fig tree, it's kind of an acted out parable. And the way Mark weaves the stories together, it's very obvious because in chapter 13 specifically, Jesus is going to connect the fig tree, the lesson of the fig tree kind of thing, into connecting it with the temple, the old system. Basically, it's on its way out. So the fig tree, which is used at times of a symbol for the people, the people of Israel, things like that. It's very obviously symbolic. The people have become like the withered fig tree, and Jesus is placing them under judgment. So with that as an overview, let's just look at the passage itself. So it begins, now when they drew near to Jerusalem, to Bethany and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, and it's going to continue on. But I want to pause here because the Mount of Olives is, as I write here, a significant location. And it's actually connected to a lot of this temple kind of imagery because this is where the glory departed, the first temple before its destruction. It is where Jesus ascended from in Acts 1 and will return to. So what I'm referring to here is the first temple, before it was destroyed, the glory of God departed it. And it's recorded in Ezekiel 11, 22, and 23. So verse 22 is picking up on the cherubim, the wings, the wheels, all that stuff, which calls back to chapter 1 and chapter 10. But in verse 23, and the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood on the mountain that is on the east side of the city. Now, it doesn't call it the Mount of Olives there, but that is indeed what it's referring to. Now, this is important because after the first temple was destroyed, the people did eventually go back to the land, to the promised land. They did rebuild the temple, but nobody ever really felt like the temple had returned back to its glory. The glory of God had never returned to the temple. And so they were kind of going through the motions as they waited to be delivered from this spiritual exile. And it's significant then that this is where Jesus begins his procession into the city, which itself is fulfilling messianic themes. But he begins his descent into the city from the east, from the Mount of Olives, the same place that the glory departed and rested on this mountain on the east side of the city. Jesus is returning to the city from this location in this procession. And again, Acts 1, this is the ascension. So this is when the angels are speaking to the disciples. And the angels say to him, this Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will come in the same way as you saw him go into heaven. And then they return to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is near Jerusalem. Point being, that's where this happened. This is where Jesus ascended from and will return to. And this is, of course, tracking on Zechariah 14, 2 through 4. So verse 2 is Armageddon type stuff, specifically though, verse 3 and 4, verse 4 specifically. On that day, his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east. So this is a significant location, but it's specifically tied to the Lord's return and also where the Lord departed, where the glory departed. But finally, the Lord is returning to his people, descending from the Mount of Olives. And of course, they're going to miss it. Now, continuing on, Mark 11, this is verse 2 and 3. And basically, what Jesus is sending out some of his disciples to go find this colt. He tells them, to take it, untie it, bring it, and if anybody asks, say the Lord has need of it, and we'll send it back here immediately, which is a word that Mark uses very often, immediately. Everything happens immediately. You see it again here in this. And I just remark here, not to make too much of this, but the language of the tying and untying, or the bound and loose language, it's the same language that's used at times of affliction and demonic oppression. But again, not to make too much of it, but it is worth noting. But specifically, this passage is a direct fulfillment of Zechariah 9. So the passage reads, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey, on the colt, the foal of a donkey." So direct fulfillment of this passage. I can't help but point out this line because it makes me laugh every time I read it. Righteous and having salvation is he. It has the same cadence as the SpongeBob theme song. It's just, it always makes me chuckle. The Faith Life Study Bible has some good notes that are worth pointing out with regards to the triumphal entry. So, kings were known to enter cities in splendor, especially during coronation or after a victorious battle. They may have ridden a chariot pulled by 4 horses or even elephants and been accompanied by troops. While Jesus does enter as king, his approach is humble. He is not accompanied by soldiers and rides on a borrowed colt. This not only emphasizes Jesus' humility as king, but also reflects the nature of the kingdom of God. Now, I do point out down here, I think that while he does arrive in his first coming in this humble way on the donkey, he does return in Revelation as a divine warrior riding on a white horse. And I also point out here about the laws of purification, Numbers 19, about how there were certain animals that were kind of set apart for sacred tasks. And this donkey had never been ridden before. I write, as though the animal was accompanied by its mother, Jesus rode on the smaller of the two, the never before ridden animal. So it is something worth thinking about. This is, the animal did fulfill this sacred task. But continuing on, now we get to the cursing of the fig tree. And this is really where I kind of want to land on. So the verse reads, "And seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, May no one ever eat fruit from you again. And his disciples heard it." I write, these events are highly symbolic. R.T. France points out figs and their trees are often symbolic of the people of God. And here he lists a number of passages. It's important because this happens, it just seems out of left field, kind of out of nowhere. But it's connected to all these events that are happening with the temple, ultimately leading up to the prophecy of the destruction of the temple. So the temple is going to wither away, as the fig tree will hear momentarily. But Jesus is going to go in, the well-known story of Jesus going and cleansing the temple. I actually don't have the text here, but it's a well-known story. I like what Lightheart wrote about this, though. He has some good comments. He says, in Mark, Jesus enters the temple twice. First to inspect the house and then to cleanse it. Now, I'm going to slightly disagree with some of the details, but ultimately I agree, but some of the details I will disagree with. As Duncan Derrett pointed out long ago, Jesus is a priestly inspector, checking first for house leprosy, then coming back to see if the leprosy has spread. He judges that the uncleanness of the temple is spreading, and therefore the house needs to be torn down until there is not one stone on another. The language of the temple action highlights the continuity between Jesus' exorcisms and his action in the temple. He enters the temple and begins to cast out the sellers. All over the land, synagogues are filled with unclean spirits. At the heart of the land, the temple has become a strongman's house, infested with demonic worshippers. Now, on the whole, I agree with what Lightheart says, but as I write down here, it's more possible that Jesus' first inspection was not technically Mark 11:11. And what he's referring to there is after the triumphal entry, he's ushered into the city with a group of people that begins in chapter 10, a group that follows Jesus But Jesus goes into the temple and he kind of looks around and then just leaves. And so Lightheart is arguing that that's the inspection, the first inspection. He looks around, sees it, and then he's going to come back uh, for a second time as the priestly inspector. But I continue here. It has been argued that Jesus cleared the temple twice, once earlier as recorded by John 2 specifically, and then during the Passion Week. Either way, the typology of a priest inspecting house leprosy seems to be in play here. So whether you take the Mark 11:11 as the first inspection, or if you take a previous cleansing of the temple in John 2, and then the ones that the synoptics record is a different time that he does it. Either way, you could argue that Jesus inspects multiple times. So let's go ahead and just read the Leviticus passage on house leprosy. I'm going to pick up, though, after the priest has already quarantined the house for 7 days to see if this is actually leprosy or whatever. And what they do is they go in, if it's still there, they will essentially take out the offending portions, replaster it, that kind of thing. And then it's going to continue. This is where we pick up. If the disease breaks out again in the house, after he has taken out the stones and scraped the house and plastered it, then the priest shall go and look. And I would argue that this is what's going on with Jesus. The first inspection, either Mark 11:11 or the previous time in John 2. Early in Jesus' ministry, he does this. He goes, inspects it. But if it's still there, and if the disease has spread in the house, it is a persistent leprous disease in the house. It is unclean. And he shall break down on the house its stones and timber, and all the plaster of the house, and he shall carry them out of the city to an unclean place. So I think the typology there is pretty obvious in that Jesus is inspecting the temple. He's done it now twice. Either view you pick, he's done this now twice. He's looked at the temple and he's declared it is unclean. And actually, France points out that it's probably inaccurate to call it a cleansing of the temple because the cleansing would have been earlier. Now, this time that Jesus has gone in, it's no longer about cleansing. It's judgment. This place is under judgment. Like the leper's house, all that can happen is you destroy it completely. You take it apart piece by piece, all the stones, everything, and dump it in the city dump in an unclean place. And so I've been tracking through Mark, but in Matthew 24:1-2, and Mark says pretty much the same thing, but it says that this is when they're leaving the temple after Jesus has been preaching. That this would be Mark 13:1-2, roughly, but this is in Matthew. He says, Jesus left the temple and was going away. When his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple, but he answered them, you see all these things, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. And this is immediately after, he's cleared out the temple and all this stuff. And then, of course, in Mark, because this would be Mark 13:1-2, he then continues on, and the disciples are going to come to Jesus and ask him, when will these things happen? And he gives kind of an Olivet discourse kind of thing to them privately, but he connects it directly to the fig tree, the symbolism. So clearly all of this is tracking on the temple. Regarding the two temple clearings, I want to read a little bit from some commentaries that talk about this. So all three synoptic writers have the cleansing. And I keep wanting to say clearing because I think that's a better way of thinking of it. But the cleansing of the temple at the end of Jesus' ministry. Only John has it at the beginning. Most commentators prefer the synoptic placement and reject the possibility of two cleansings. But why Jesus could not have cleansed the temple twice, once at the beginning and once at the end of his public ministry, is never adequately explained. And I would agree with them here. Now, this is in the same commentary series. This is the Expositor's Bible Commentary, Volume 8. And this is in the A. Carson's portion of Matthew. And he's speaking about this same issue, that the great majority of contemporary scholars believe there was only one cleansing of the temple, and they basically debate about which one was more likely, so on and so forth. But he says, yet there are, in this instance, numerous reasons for the possibility, indeed the likelihood, of two separate cleansings, something most commentators never seriously consider. And here he's going to give kind of 5 reasons, or he's going to make 5 points. I'll just kind of summarize them a bit. So on the first point, Leon Morris has noted a bunch of differences in the details of the two events, assuming they're two different events. But again, many commentaries assume it's one event, but then they pick one side. Usually the synoptics, they'll say, well, that one's the more accurate account. Or why couldn't they just be two different events? And then they're both accurate, right? Point number two, it's usually argued that which does seem to be the common, that the writers arrange things topically. And so they assume that what John is doing is moving this story earlier for topical reasons in part of the replacement theme, basically Jesus replacing the temple. But they never explain why John moved this early. Why move the theme? Why couldn't it just be a late theme like it's in the synoptics? Point number three is basically kind of the argument from silence, in that they don't mention it earlier. The synoptics don't, but they also don't mention Jesus' entire early Judean ministry at all. So that's not surprising. Point number 4 and 5 kind of go together in a sense. Basically, the argument is they would not have allowed this to happen twice. But as they point out, this would have been 2 or 3 years later. And another important thing, in my opinion, is the fact that, and part of it, like I said, part of this goes into 5, is it's difficult to tell how much that the cleansing contributed to the official action against Jesus. And to overstate the evidence is easy. So the point is, how much of this contributed to him being crucified, essentially. But like I said, they kind of go together. But I think these 2 points argue against people like R.T. France who argue against the two cleansings approach, because it's as if they assume all the events that led up to the triumphal entry also happened in the temple clearing event in John. That is, in the synoptics, Jesus does all these things. He's being hailed now as the Messiah. They're calling him Son of David, and he's letting them, he's not telling them to be quiet about that. You have these messianic titles and ideas being thrown about. He's now making all these provocative statements, and this is after 3 years of ministry now. If Jesus did this early in his ministry once, as John 2 records, he wouldn't have had that same momentum behind him. And he didn't do this arriving on a donkey, directly fulfilling prophecy, and being hailed as the Messiah. Now, he did do that at the end of his ministry, but if he didn't do that early in his ministry, he would have just been looked at as some radical person who did something. I don't see him getting crucified for that, basically, for just doing that. And then it's been 3 years. They're not going to be on high alert. He could have done it again. And now he has a movement behind him. Again, we're told in Mark 10 that there is a crowd that's following him to Jerusalem. So now you can't ignore it anymore. You have to address it. And so I think the two clearing views is on the table, and I do take that view. Now, just to tie up a couple of loose ends now here, looking at the text itself, one thing worth noting is, so we have Jesus arrive on the donkey, and it's often tied directly to Zechariah, because it very obviously is tracking on that. But it also has echoes to Exodus 4, specifically verse 20. So the Lord tells Moses that all the people back in Egypt that were seeking his life are dead. So Moses took his wife and his sons and had them ride on a donkey. And he went back to the land of Egypt, and Moses took the staff of God in his hand. Now, by itself, it might just seem artificial, superficial, that it's 2 donkeys in both stories. But there is a lot of Exodus going on in Mark's gospel. So you have the miraculous feeding of the 4,000, 5,000, that kind of thing. And that echoes to the manna from heaven kind of miracle in the Exodus. You have the legion of the demonic possession, where they enter in pigs and then cast themselves into the sea, which echoes the drowning of Pharaoh and his armies in the sea. You have the passing by in the water, Jesus walking on the water towards the disciples, intending to pass by them, and they speak out to Jesus, and he replies to them, I am. He doesn't say it is I or something. It's usually translated clunky like that, but he literally says I am, right? The divine name, he says back to them. You could go on and on. I mean, it just happens all over the place. And so I think that this is another one. It also echoes a bit of the binding of Isaac in Genesis 22. So in Genesis 22, they go to the land of Moriah, which is the only 2 times you have Mount Moriah is here in this passage, and it's the future temple site. I believe it's 2 Chronicles 3, if memory serves. This passage is often brought up in conjunction with the crucifixion, because Abraham takes the wood for the burnt offering and he lays it on Isaac, his son, right, which echoes what Christ does carrying the cross. It's also worth noting here that when the angel stops him from sacrificing Isaac, Abraham calls that place the Lord will provide, right? This is the whole Jehovah Jireh thing. But what's interesting is we would think that he calls it that because the Lord provided the ram as a replacement for Isaac, but he puts it in the future tense. The Lord will provide someday. The Lord will provide in the future. And of course, this on one hand looks forward to the future temple site, Mount Moriah again, but it ultimately, even that itself, was only a shadow of the future ultimate sacrifice, the ultimate offering of Jesus himself. And the last thing I want to look at is I noted that one of the passages that was brought up by R.T. France was Jeremiah 8:13, which is a passage I had noted in just a recent previous video. It was the one on Cain and Abel. I got a little bit into this because I was looking at the language in Genesis 3, verse 7 specifically. And this is when after their eyes were open, when Adam and Eve eat from the tree, it says they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. So I was tracking on the fig leaves language, and I noted both fig and leaves are both very rare terms, and they usually deal with something like eschatological end of an age kind of ideas, which is interesting. It's interesting because both of those terms, though, showing up in conjunction together, only show up in 3 passages. So we have Genesis 3:7, and then there's Isaiah 34, specifically verse 4. All the hosts of heaven shall rot away, and the skies roll up like a scroll. All their hosts shall fall, as leaves fall from the vine, like leaves falling from the fig tree. And so here we have both of our terms here, the leaves and the fig. Very Psalm 82, very already but not yet, kind of punishment of the powers, the removal of the old system, that kind of thing. And then he brought up Jeremiah 8:13, which in that Cain and Abel video I made, I pointed out that I'd never tracked on this passage, but it's significant in light of Mark. Verse 13 reads, "When I would gather them, declares the Lord, there are no grapes on the vine, nor figs on the fig tree. Even the leaves are withered, and what I gave them has passed away from them." So the footnote does refer to the stories, although they only give the others. They don't actually give Mark. They give Matthew and Luke's account. There's at least 2 things worth pointing out here. One is kind of the more practical side of this, in that it's been noted by many commentaries and whatnot. The fact that it had leaves on it already signaled that it could have already begun the kind of budding process. There should have been something edible already. And so it showed the outward signs, the outward appearance of bearing fruit, but it was barren. And of course, again, remember, this is symbolic of the old system, the temple system. And it's especially interesting that the beginning of that kind of sacrificial system, I would argue, begins in Genesis 3:7, specifically, though, the inadequacy of the vegetation as a covering, because it's in Genesis 3:21 that God replaces their fig garments, their leafy garments, for garments of skins that God clothes them with. So they needed an animal substitute. They needed the blood substitute. And I think this goes on into Cain and Abel, where they, one offers grain, the other offers an animal. One's accepted, one's rejected. The accepted one is the animal. And so this is the beginning of that system. Here is kind of, in a sense, the end of it, or the signal, or the prophecy of the end of that system, in showing the barrenness of the fig tree. That this kind of ties all together. And I don't find it surprising that you have such eschatological language being used, like in a place like Isaiah 34, where you have the very rare terminology being all brought together here. Like I said, on one hand, you have the practical aspect of it showing signs of bearing fruit, but it wasn't. And people will point out that technically it is true that you can find some edible stuff when it begins the leafing process. But I also think, I believe it was also Duncan Dare that pointed this out in an article. If I'm tracking his article, because it was a dense read, but if I followed his argument, I think essentially what Jesus was doing was testing if it was operating in the Messianic age, because you have this lion and the lamb type imagery, this Edenic state described, where the trees are yielding fruit regardless of the season, these kinds of ideas. And so it was essentially a test of whether this tree was operating under the Messianic age. And it wasn't. Again, think symbolically, though. The tree is symbolic of the temple and the nation of Israel and that kind of thing. And the tree ultimately didn't pass the vibe check, as people would say. And so it was doomed to pass away, to wither and pass away. And actually, given the fact that it says, may no one ever eat fruit from you again, the way this is translated. But if you actually look, you see the term down here, aeon, or, which very often is going to get translated as something like age. It most commonly is translated as age, or forever, forevermore, that kind of thing. And of course, it takes that language of never again, right? I do think that is worth thinking about. The idea of this kind of as a test of the Messianic age, the already but not yet inaugurated eschatology. But these were some of my scattered thoughts on the Passion Week, Palm Sunday, as it approaches. And I'll see you guys next time.